to start out today before I jump into my official presentation. Can you hear me, by the way? Okay. With an article that I saw in the Parade magazine from last week. You probably can't see that from out here, but the title is Preserve Your Family Memories. And the little subtitle up here is Don't Let Your Aging Photos Gather Dust in a Shoebox. Here are some easy ways that you can preserve your family memories. And this goes on to document how you can preserve your family photographs and other materials by digitizing them. And this is sort of the antithesis of what we're going to talk about today. That's why I thought it was funny. So let's, throw Parade magazine out the door. We're going to talk about some methods today for preserving historic photographs in your own collection and in a museum collection that are both easier than digitizing, they are faster than digitizing, and they are ultimately cheaper than digitizing because you don't have to buy any of the material, and ultimately you won't ever have to upgrade them. Once you do it, that's it. Technology isn't advancing that quickly. So what I want to do is first start out by going through some of the types of photographs that you typically find in small museum collections and in private collections, and just talking about some of the features that distinguish them. And then, you'll have to forgive me, I'm going to move into a little bit of preservation theory. And so then we're going to talk about preservation and some of the factors that affect photographs and how we can combat them. And then the last part of the lecture is going to be a little bit more hands-on. I have some fun photographs, and we're going to see how we in the APVA do the actual physical preservation of the photographs in our collection and how you can adapt those methods for use at home. So without further ado, formal presentation begins. And tell me if I'm talking too fast. Okay. The first type of photograph that I want to talk about is the Daguerreotype, and we're just going to breeze through these really quickly. I'm sure I could talk for a lot longer and go into a lot more depth, but we won't. Yes, can we turn the lights down? The Daguerreotype was the first type of photograph that was commercially available, and these are typically found from about 1839 when the technique was introduced in France through about the mid-1850s, not 1950s, when cheaper and better technologies replaced it. And what a daguerreotype is it's a specially chemically treated metal plate that is mounted behind a piece of glass and placed in a small leather and wooden case. And the thing about a daguerreotype that's different from what we tend to think of as photographs today is that they are unique images. It wasn't a negative process, so each image is unique and special. And this, sort of disappeared for a while. And the way you can tell the daguerreotype is by its mirror-like qualities. If you hold it at a certain angle, the image sort of disappears. But in terms of preservation, on a basic level, we treat them essentially the same way we treat other cased photographs. So it's not so important to know whether it's a daguerreotype or another type of photograph. But just, FYI, if you want to know what it is, that's one way. And this is how those case photographs are constructed, and I kind of think this is a neat slide. You can see on what side is that, left or right? I don't know my left and my right apart, but where you have A, B, C, D, E, F, G, you can see in the back is the plate, and then there's a little matte sort of frame, and then the glass, and then more decorative frames, and then the whole shebang goes into that little wooden and leather case with the faced velvet, and that's very typical, and it's neat to see it broken up like that. The other typical kind of cased photograph that we find is called the Ambrotype. And these were introduced in 1854, and they continued to be popular through about the 1870s, roughly. And they appear, I'm sorry you can't see that image very well. This is actually one from our collection, and it's John Marshall's son and his wife. But the image is made a little bit differently. This is a negative type process, and the image is made on a piece of glass which is backed with a dark material so that you can see the image. And like a daguerreotype, these are usually placed in small cases, and you can tell them apart not only by the later date of the costuming and so forth, but they don't have that mirror-like quality that a daguerreotype has. And then there's the Tintype, which is basically the same photographic process as an Ambrotype, but they were a little less expensive than Ambrotypes, which were much less expensive than daguerreotypes. and the images weren't quite as high quality, but they were popular because of their durability and their low cost. And sometimes these were placed in cases to make them look like they were the more expensive Ambrotypes and Daguerreotypes, but just as often they were placed in these sort of cardboard things. So they're fairly easy to tell. Then we move into the paper-based photographic processes, and the earliest of these that we're going to talk about is called the albumin process, and albumin refers to how the image was laid on. Albumin is made with egg white, which is what was used to put the image onto the paper. These are also colloquially known as card photographs because they were printed onto very, very thin paper, and so usually the paper was mounted onto a piece of cardboard to give it more stability. These came in all different shapes and sizes and forms. The example here is a carte de visite CDV, which were very popular in the pre-Civil War era. Also, stereoscopes, those dual stereoscope slides are the same process, the paper mounted on cardboard. And here's another example of just a typical print on a large cardboard backing. Moving forward a little bit, we move into what we recognize as modern photographic processes, starting with the black and white photography, which was introduced around 1871 and really became popular in the late 1890s after the introduction of the Brownie camera from Kodak, which really put photography into the hands of the amateur. The way this worked is you purchased the camera with film in it, you would take your snapshots and then send the film and the camera, film in the camera, back to the manufacturer who would develop the photographs, return the photographs to you, and reload the camera with film. So this is where we start to see amateur photography. One thing to note about modern black and white photographic film is if you have old negatives, this is just sort of something to be aware of. Many of the early negative films were made with cellulose nitrate, I think, and they're very unstable and very dangerous. So if you have old negatives in your collection, you'll want to take those to an expert and have them copied over and destroy the originals because they can explode, and they are treated as hazardous waste. So be aware. Color photography was introduced in 1935 with the Kodachrome process by Kodak. And the main thing to be aware of with color photography is, especially before about the 1980s, this is a very light-sensitive photographic process, and the prints will fade very quickly if they're exposed to light. And we're going to talk about some methods of controlling this later on. But keep this in mind because so much of the 20th century is documented on standard, Kodak type or whatever, color film. And it's going to cause major problems down the road, I foresee. And then finally we have the Polaroid, which is, I like this, it's sort of whimsical. This is a second half of the 20th century phenomenon, and like the Daguerreotype, they're unique images. So here we are, full circle. I haven't read a whole lot about the long-term preservation of these particular objects. I would suspect that they're probably susceptible to degradation over time just because of the chemicals inside the pod. So if a large collection of your family photographs are in this media, I would recommend in this particular instance thinking about digitizing now rather than later, just so that you don't lose them. I'd be eager to know if anyone knows any more detailed information about this. This is not something we encounter in our museum, so this is why I don't know a whole lot about it. And now that we're entering the 21st century, digital photography is becoming more and more prevalent. And again, digital has a lot of the same problems as early color photography. It's very light sensitive, those prints. So in general, I favor black and white photography. That's what we use for documentation in the museum field. It's the most stable. It's going to last the longest. If you need to take photographs of a really important event, don't just do digital. Try and get some print, just for the future. Okay, now we move into the theory. The title of my talk was chosen very specifically. Preserving historic photographs, not conserving historic photographs. And what's the difference? Why did I choose that? Well, it's a very important difference. And pardon me while I get theoretical, but I promise we'll get back to the fun stuff in a minute. there's a very important difference between conservation and preservation in this field. And obviously, as the Association for the Preservation of Virginia Antiquities, we are all rah-rah gung-ho on preservation. But first, we're going to talk about what I'm not going to be discussing in this particular lecture. And that is to say conservation. And conservation, it's used to treat existing damage to an object. So if I have a photograph and it's torn, I've torn it in half. Conservation is, say, reattaching the two halves and filling in the parts that were destroyed so that it looks like a complete image. But it's correcting damage. And because it's correcting damage, we can never get the object back fully to where it originally was. It's always corrective, but we may have it wrong. So it's always important to make sure that it's reversible and that it's performed by a trained professional. So you never want to undertake anything invasive on your own. You always want to seek out a professional, just because otherwise you might unknowingly cause damage to an object that could be prevented otherwise. And if you're interested in contacting a conservator, I have some cards over there. I'd be happy to recommend or get you in touch with a professional photographs conservator in Virginia. There are quite a few, and they should be able to help you out. But what we will be talking about is preservation, which is far more important than conservation, because preservation is what we do to prevent the need for conservation. Preservation is the techniques we use to stabilize and rehouse our objects to prevent damage. And the reason this is so much more important is because you can never undo damage that has been caused. But if you stop the damage, it never happened. There was never anything to correct. And that's always better, always better. And this also has some other key advantages for a small museum or for a private individual, and that is that it can be done by anyone. You don't have to be a trained professional to do this. These are simple, common sense techniques that we can all use to help preserve our important objects, whether they be from our museum or from our personal lives. And finally, it's cheaper. It's very inexpensive. Conservators, goodness, they must make a good living. They charge a lot. I wish I was a conservator, but I don't have the patience. But preservation methods can be as simple as going to the drugstore and buying a $1.99 pair of gloves. And that can make a huge difference. And so there are really things that we can do. Now, forgive me for using a technical term. The type of preservation that we're going to be talking about today is called preventive conservation. And that's a term that was developed by professional conservators to describe what all we're going to talk about. And these are interchangeable, and I will probably use them both. And this understanding of preservation of objects or preventive conservation of objects is based on an awareness of agents of deterioration, another technical term, but I'll explain what I mean. Agents of deterioration are the forces and the factors that affect how our objects survive over time. And conservators have developed, how many is that, 10, 11, something like that, agents of deterioration that affect collections objects. And these are listed in order of severity. The most destructive are at the top, the least destructive are at the bottom. Now you may be saying, if you know anything about museums, I see temperature and humidity at the bottom. Isn't that what you worry about all the time at museums? Well, yes, we do, but there's a reason they're at the bottom. Going back to what I said about preservation versus conservation, if you look at physical forces, again, let's talk about a photograph. If we tear up that photograph, that's a physical force acting on the photograph. It's gone, the damage is done, there's nothing we can do to repair it. If we tear it up into little itty-bitty bits, all that information is lost. Same thing with thieves. If someone steals that photograph, it's gone, there's nothing we can do, we have no information, we can't benefit from it in any way. But moving further down this list, as we get to light, temperature, humidity, these are far slower processes. They're ones that cause gradual damage. And so if something is exposed to inappropriate levels of humidity, for example, you're probably not going to completely lose the item. With a photograph, you might have warping or something, but you're still going to be able to get some benefit from that item. So when we think about preservation, we want to think from the top down. We want to think about everything, because everything is important, but we want to think about the things at the top first, and then worry about the things at the bottom, because the things at the top are fairly easy to control, and the things at the bottom aren't always, which is fairly convenient. So running through these one by one, and I'll do this quickly. physical forces, some of the problems that can affect photographs: abrasion, where you rub the surface of the photograph, sticking and tearing from glues, tapes, adhesives, breakage if you drop something that's glass, bending, anything like that is a physical force. And some ways to think about avoiding these problems are to avoid using adhesives, anything that might cause tearing. You know, if tearing is a problem, avoid the things that cause tearing. This is all going to be really common sense. This is my overarching theme. To prevent abrasion, you want to put plastic sleeves around photographs, or put acid-free papers in between, or tissue papers, anything that's going to prevent them rubbing against each other. You want to handle carefully. This is really commonsensical, but you know, to move away from the photographs for a moment, if you have a piece of ceramic, if you drop it, it's gone, it's broken. But if you handle it carefully, you can reduce the chance that it's going to be dropped. Next, thieves, vandals, and displacers. And this is one that is more of an issue for us in the museum world and less of an issue, say, with private photographic collections, because who's going to break in and steal your family photo album? But it's worth thinking about, and one thing in particular to think about is loss. You don't want to lose track of things, so maybe store them all together. You know, it's pretty simple, pretty common sense. And you know, don't label the box with all your family photographs priceless family relics or something like that. You don't want to make it attractive, but again, this isn't really something that the home collector needs to worry about too much. Fire, we all know the problems that fire can cause to paper: burning, smoke. It can also cause darkening of the paper, all kinds of bad things. Again, very common sense how we can avoid these: store them away from anywhere that might emit sparks, keep a fire extinguisher in your house, keep a smoke detector, you know, things we should do anyway. But it's worth just thinking about them, because if we think about them, we're ready to deal with them. Forewarned is forearmed, as the Boy Scouts say, or whoever says that. Next, water. Again, I think we're all familiar with the problems that water can cause for photographs. Warping, it can cause them to stick together. You can have water staining. You can cause flaking on certain types of photographs. Any type of destruction like that. It'll also cause some of the problems related to humidity that we'll discuss later. Again, very common sense solutions. Don't store photographs anywhere where they can get exposed to water. Not near pipes. You know, you don't want to store them under your kitchen sink. Don't store them in your bathroom. But don't store them in your basement. And that's one that a lot of people don't necessarily think of, because basements are prone to flooding. They all are. And you just don't want to take that chance. Or if you must store them in the basement, at least store them up off the floor. And another simple thing is, when you're looking at your photos, if you have them in an album or something like that, just put the glass of water, put the glass of wine, put the glass of soda on another table while you're doing that. Make it a special activity, because if it's not nearby, there can't be an accident. And we're all careful, but we all have accidents. Pests. We all know what kinds of problems pests can cause: insects, rodents, but especially silverfish, which are very attracted to paper, books and collections of papers and things like that. Common sense solutions: store photographs up off the ground, away from where pests can get them. Store them on inside walls, away from any entrances into the house. And another key thing is you want to inspect your photographs regularly, and this goes for any collection. Don't just box them up and leave them for years and years and years, because then if some damage is occurring, you'll never know. It'll just continue. But say with pest infestation, if you open up the box and take 5 minutes every 6 months to look and see if there are any mice nibbles or any insect droppings or anything like that, and you see it, then you can correct it. But if you don't see it, you're not going to correct it. So awareness. Okay, environmental contaminants. I'm sorry this is sort of a crowded slide, but this is one of the major factors for small museum collections and for home collections. Any place where we can't afford a multi-million-dollar HVAC system to filter our air, this is a major concern. We need to think about things like mold and fungi that are also affected by moisture in the air, but also damage from airborne dust particles, smoke especially, damage from acidic materials in our skins, acid in our skin. And one really key element here is to think about the storage materials that you're using. And the reason we think about the storage materials that we're using is this. We want the storage materials that we use to protect the objects that we're trying to preserve from the outside environment, with the smoke, with the dust, with any type of airborne particle. But by putting it in a box or putting it in an album, we're creating what we call a microenvironment, which means that it's much more concentrated. Anything bad in that box is going to have an extra bad effect, for lack of more eloquence, on the objects stored in the box, because they're in such close proximity. So you want to make sure that any material you use to store objects that you want to preserve is not going to cause more harm than good. So you always want to use acid-free materials, materials that are not going to off-gas noxious fumes that cause damage, and so on and so forth. So that's why the acid-free materials. Again, solutions: store things in enclosed containers, store them away from smoke, store them in acid-free conservation-grade materials. Light. This is a major one for photographs. The main factor in light is ultraviolet radiation, which is found in sunlight, and it's also found in some other types of light bulbs, particularly fluorescent lights. And I think as we become more conscious of energy usage, we're moving more towards compact fluorescence in our own homes. I have compact fluorescent in my house, and I need to be aware of its effect on the objects in my home. This can cause, as we all know, I'm sure, fading of photographs. It can also cause darkening of some sorts of photographs, depending on the process. And the problem with light damage is it's not correctable. It's cumulative and it's irreversible. An object has a certain amount of exposure to UV radiation in its life. This can happen quickly by, say, being displayed someplace where direct sunlight is going to fall on it. And I've measured direct sunlight. It sometimes has 20, 30, 40, even 50 times as much light as museum folks recommend for long-term exposure for light-sensitive objects. Or it can be slowly over the life of an object. We've all seen things that have been on the wall for 50 years, and 50 years later they look very different than they did when they first got there. So that's why you really, really want to be aware of light. If you're going to display something in the open, and particularly if it's color, you might want to have a backup copy that you save, just for documentation purposes. Whenever possible, you want to store things in a closed album or a closed box and only expose them to light when you're looking at them. But if you do want to display something, you can get some UV filter, plexiglass, or glass to put in frames that will protect it and help extend the life of the objects, and that's not that expensive, and it should be available locally. And finally, temperature and relative humidity, those two banes of the museum person's existence. The real problem with temperature and humidity is either extremes: too hot, too cold, too dry, too wet, or rapid fluctuation, going from a very, very dry day to a very, 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 very wet day in 24 hours or 36 hours. And those fluctuations and those extremes can cause structural damage to photographic paper and to other materials used in photographs. But that's a slow damage over time that you just want to be aware of. And this is actually an easy one to combat in the home. Ideally, in the museum world, we say that photographs should be stored at least 68 degrees, preferably cooler, with 45 to 55% relative humidity. Well, that's just, there's no way we're going to maintain that in a living space. But photographs like to live where people live, because those are the areas that are climate controlled, and those are the areas that you're naturally going to prevent from fluctuating too much. If it gets too hot, you're going to turn on the air conditioner. If it gets too cold, you're going to turn on the heater. So an easy way to sort of do basic control of temperature and relative humidity is to just put the stuff in the main part of your house rather than the attic or the basement, and then you're going to naturally regulate it, and you're going to, without even thinking about it, you're going to be creating a fairly good environment. Okay, theory over. Now we move on to the fun stuff. Museum techniques and materials for storing historic photographs. And when we think about museum techniques for preserving objects and for storing things, we tend to think about big museums like the Smithsonian or the Library of Congress, or someplace with a very large budget and a very large staff dedicated to doing this. And indeed, these types of places can come up with very complicated methods of storage. This is an example of how the Library of Congress is preserving the Matthew Brady daguerreotypes from the Civil War. And this is rather fussy and difficult. You can see they've put them in a polypropylene mat, which is a non-reactive plastic material. And they've covered them with mylar, which is, again, another non-reactive plastic. And they've got glass in there, and they've got Permacell J-lar tape, which I don't even know what that is. This is not the type of thing that we really can or even want to replicate in our homes. But smaller museums, like the APVA, really use methods that can be easily duplicated at home with a few little tweaks for personal preference. And so I'm going to go through and show you how we preserve our photographs in our photographic collection that documents the history of our sites at our offices in the APVA. And then I'm going to show you how you can adapt those methods at home and where you can get the materials to do them. And some of the supplies that we use, and I've brought some samples, so after the lecture, feel free to come and take a look at them, touch them, do whatever you want, so you can actually see what they are. But some of the supplies that we use are acid-free boxes, and we use the type with lift-off lids, but that, you don't have to. Acid-free folding folders, like a standard manila folder, but they're made of acid-free material. Clear polyester photo sleeves, which are just thin plastic sleeves that surround a photo. Cotton gloves, acid-free tissue, acid-free folding paper sleeves, and I thought I had one, but I guess I don't. Soft lead pencils, just your typical pencil from the drugstore. And we also use Ethifoam, which is something you're probably not going to be able to get at home. It's a closed cell polyethylene foam. And it's just nice because it's a good cushioning material, but you have to get it in rolls like this from DuPont, so it's not so adaptable to home use. But it's marvelous, marvelous stuff. So step one is to gather our materials. And the key material there is the pair of white gloves that I have, which I put on before handling any photographs, because they're going to protect the photograph from the acids and the oils and the dirt in my hands. And just that one simple step makes a huge difference, and it's so easy. So you can't see it, but on the one side there's the photograph, which is the interior of the John Marshall House. This is our stairs. And on the other side there's a plastic photo sleeve, which looks sort of like this, but without the label. Next, I label the photograph, and we generally label our photographs with an identification of what it is, any sitters who are in the photograph, and an approximate date. And we do that labeling in pencil along either the top edge or the bottom edge, and you do it very lightly so that you don't make any indentations, and you sort of dull your pencil before you do it so it's not too sharp. But you always do it around the edges so that even if you do make an indentation, it's not in the center of the photograph. Next, you place the photograph in the protective sleeve, and these come in all different sizes. Our photograph on the left is in a standard 8x10 print size, but they also come in smaller sizes that are customizable. The Jamestown Church Tower photograph is about like this. And that's actually one of those albumin print photographs that's on the very thin paper, and you can sort of see it's not in great condition after all these years because the paper is so thin. Next, we place the sleeved and labeled photograph into a labeled file folder, and this one contains all of the interior photographs of the Marshall House. And then finally, we place it into the acid-free box, which this acid-free box contains all of the Bacon's Castle and Marshall House photographs together. So they're sorted and they're stored by type. If we have other types of photographs, we treat them a little bit differently. If I have an albumin photograph on a card, I put it in a folding paper sleeve rather than the plastic sleeves, because the plastic sleeves just sort of come off. These work better for our purposes. And the process is the same. I label the back of the photograph, I place it in the paper sleeve, fold up the paper sleeve, and the paper sleeve has been labeled with the same information that's on the photograph so that you don't have to take it out to see what it is. Oversized photographs, they don't make these sleeves this big, so if we have a big print, we interleave them with acid-free tissue paper and place them in an oversized folder, and then place the oversized folders in an oversized box. And then finally, if we have a case photograph, It goes into an acid-free box, which is padded with ethifoam, but that's an optional step. And then the edges, I crinkle up some acid-free tissue or any other padding material to keep it from rattling in the box when the box is moved. And then the top goes on and it's labeled. So what types of products can you use at home to achieve these same results, and where can you get them? Well, the obvious, wrong slide. Materials you want to avoid when you're storing historic photographs and historic papers. You want to avoid anything metal because it's going to rust. Paper clips, staples, they're really, really nasty. You also want to avoid rubber bands because they degrade very quickly. It only takes a few years, and they leave really, really nasty residue. You want to avoid any type of permanent adhesives, particularly rubber cement, most adhesive tapes, white glue, Post-it notes, anything like that that isn't specifically conservation grade, you want to avoid. And even then, you probably don't want to use it unless you're mounting them in an album. You want to avoid any paper that's not acid-free, particularly newspaper, tissue paper, that sort of thing. You really, really, really want to avoid cardboard boxes that are not acid-free, particularly corrugated boxes. If you do one thing, get a proper box. You want to avoid any type of plastic that's made of PVC or any plastic that's not identified as conservationally safe. And you want to avoid using pen on photographs to label them, and also adhesive stickers on photographs to label them. Use the pencil. So we know what materials to avoid. Now, what materials do we use? Plastic paper clips, and I have some examples over here. They're too small. They won't show up if I hold them, but go look at them afterwards. They are not the rubber-coated metal ones that are shaped like normal paper clips. They're actually shaped differently. They're V-shaped, and they will not rust. They won't degrade. They're quite stable over time. Only use adhesives that are specially identified, acid-free papers, acid-free boxes, acid-free photo albums, acid-free pages. Any plastic materials you want to be made of polyethylene, polypropylene, or polyester. And I should say that this slide, the next slide, and another slide at the end are all in a handout that I have for you. So you can take this information away and use it later, along with some resources. You want to use soft lead pencils, and you want to use cotton gloves. So where can you get these things? The obvious source is where we get them, archival supply catalogs. And I have some sample catalogs. Please feel free to take one with you. Some good companies are Light Impressions, which caters more to the non-professional, the home genealogist or whatever. Their prices are a little higher, but their materials are a little prettier, and they don't require that you buy 3 boxes, they'll sell you 1 box. They don't require that you buy 100 sleeves, they'll sell you 10 sleeves. Or you can go with a professional archival supply company such as Gaylord or the Hollinger Corporation, which is based in Fredericksburg. Good Virginia company, give them business. I am the Association for the Preservation of Virginia. So some of the things that you can get from these outfits, so you can get special kits that include all of the material you need. And I think this one on the left is a really nice one because it gives you the gloves, it gives you the sleeves. I think there's even a little instruction booklet in there. It's all there for $17.80. Does it get cheaper than that? This other one on the other side is good for a more modern collection. Those hold regular prints, and you can store them and label them in nice acid-free materials. But that box is very attractive. It's just a nice black box, but it's acid-free and it's conservation safe. That one's from Light Impressions. You can get plastic sleeves, paper sleeves, like we've been talking about, tissues, papers. You can get the acid-free boxes, and they come in 2 styles. The lift-off lid that we use and the flip-top lid, like the one I have there, that you'll also see. Either one is fine. The Light Impressions especially sells a wonderful range of acid-free albums and pages. They do a good research. They sell good stuff. Anything you get there, you can pretty much trust. But there are also local supply places that you can use to get some materials that will be appropriate. The whole scrapbooking movement has just been a boon. You can get all kinds of wonderful acid-free, conservation-grade materials at hobby stores like Joann's, Michael's, even Walmart sometimes carries these materials. Just read the label, make sure you're getting something that's acid-free or conservation-grade. And they'll sell albums, pages, adhesives, sleeves, even different pens and markers if you want to get into that, although I don't recommend it. And then this is sort of the hidden gem. You can pick up white cotton gloves. You don't have to buy them by the dozen like I do. You can pick them up for about $1.99 a pair at your local CVS, Walgreens, Eckerd, Walmart, wherever, any place that has a beauty supply section. Go to the manicure area with the hand creams. You can buy these things by the pair. You only need one. Throw it in the wash when it's dirty. Keep it with the photographs. You won't be sorry. And then finally, you can go to framing shops if you want to display your photographs and ask for conservation-grade materials, acid-free mounts, and UV glass. And sometimes they're a little more expensive. They're always a little more expensive, but I think it's worth it for what you get in the end and their quality. So we have just a summary, and this is in the handout. Store photographs off the floor in a secure location in the main climate-controlled living area of the house, like on an interior shelf or an interior closet. Don't store them in the basement or the attic. Keep them out of direct light, either in a box or behind UV glass. Store them in acid-free boxes or albums protected by archival quality sleeves or pages. Handle photographs infrequently, because if you don't handle them, you're not going to damage them. When you do, wear gloves or make sure they're in those sleeves that will protect them from the acids and the oils in your hand. Don't do anything that's not reversible. That's why we use pencil rather than pen.